I'm not sure what it is about the witching hours of 2 to 3 a.m., but those are certainly nearly like clockwork when I find myself just descending into the abyss of existentialism, rumination, things of the like. And I guess a thought that I had had this morning has now come to the surface once again, which has to do with a particular individual that in some ways, I suppose, has a significant part of my heart. And I hesitate to say that because I'm just unsure how to distinguish between love and limerence. And I know that that's something that is fairly prolific across pop culture at the moment, certainly within YouTube and therapy spaces. And I think a big part of their overlap comes from a lot of the more fantastical versions of love that were presented when we're younger, whether it's through Disney movies that people often talk about or actual fairy tale story books, even young adult novels, I think, are definitely infused with that type of romance. And I think that's where a lot of the wire crossing comes in, because we feel as though the moment is supposed to feel cosmic and you're supposed to look across the room and see your person, and you're supposed to both be completely enraptured by the other. And that is your past, your present, your future. All moments have led to that moment. And what's interesting is that even in modern society, I've heard a multitude of stories from even fairly almost scientifically based individuals, right? Like tons of online doctors or scientists have talked about their relationships and the fact that, yeah, they just knew. They saw their spouse, who would eventually become their spouse. They saw this individual and they just immediately knew. And I guess I bring that up because this particular person is the only person in my entire life for which I felt that. And I saw them from across the room in college, and something in my soul had to stop. And I certainly engaged in limerence for the majority of my time in college and didn't really try to cultivate any type of relationship, largely because of how I felt about myself. And it's not to say that I was gaslighting myself or having imposter syndrome or something along those lines. I saw who he was around, right? I saw who his friends were. I saw the company he kept. And as time went on, I saw who he ended up dating. And none of these people in any which way, from what I could tell, had parallels to me. And they were in completely different social circles, were invited into completely different social circles. And so it very much seemed like, I guess as opposite as, well, I mean, star-crossed, I guess in some ways means that it doesn't really work out, right? So perhaps it's star-crossed. I viewed it more as maybe ships in the night, or really just unrequited, I guess is the purest way to refer to it. And I was okay with that. I, at one point, shot my shot. And so it didn't work. And time went on. There were some polite exchanges back and forth, and it was more so because we had crossed paths in a more formal setting. We had done an extracurricular together, and that was pretty much it. That was the, I guess, bulk of our dynamic. And what's funny is I saw him recently at a reunion, and I think we have very different understandings of how those years went. And I think he had a not necessarily more optimistic, but perhaps a more rose-colored version of events, and maybe I had a more cynical version. And I don't know, maybe it is just the nature of his personality. He sort of is a more fun-loving. It's not that he can't be serious, but I think he is ever the optimist, and even if he doesn't feel that internally, he tries to at least put that externally for the benefit of others. That tends to be his personality. Whereas myself, I commiserate. That's how I bond with people, and I tend to occupy more of that mindset. Anywho, he seemed to indicate to me that he remembers it very differently and thought that it was very clear on his end that there was potential, I suppose, is the best way I can put it. And I didn't see that at all. 0%. Now, all of this is leading up to, I suppose, where I am now. And the reunion was 5 years later. Yeah. So it was sort of this great revelation. There was some sort of indicator of mutualities. And unfortunately, due to geographic constraints, nothing was able to happen. And I think I've been not necessarily recently toying with the idea, but after that revelation occurred, I certainly toyed with the idea of never having known, and if ignorance really was bliss, because at that time, or I should say prior to that time, I didn't even know it was a possibility. So, time heals most things, and whatever that empty space was certainly had been filled by other possibilities. And I think once the opportunity or potential for this person to fold back into my life arose, it just sort of opened up old things. Not necessarily wounds, but it certainly opened up parts of myself that I had hoped had been patched up with other things. 5 years can do a lot to an individual, and by that point I had already quite nearly completed grad school, and so I was in a different headspace, and then being brought back to the psyche that I occupied at the time I was in college, when I was so enraptured by this human being. I don't know. I suppose an example I could provide is when you go home and you're around your siblings, you're around your parents, or even your home friends. I feel like we all sort of revert back to whatever role we used to play in those scenarios, right? So say now, I'm a pretty balanced person, whereas when I was growing up, I definitely was more of a dynamic kid, and certainly easily irritated by my siblings, and they knew how to push my buttons, and it was a fun time for them. And even though I don't occupy that role in my adult life so much, when I go home, I certainly find myself falling into old roles, and I imagine that's a similar phenomenon. And when it came to this individual, I was worried that I would be falling back into the role that I had for myself in relation to this person. So the sort of, not necessarily low self-esteem, but the lower social status, or the feeling as though I would always be longing for this person. I don't necessarily know if that came to manifest. It's interesting because though I occupied a state of limerence for 4 years, to have it be reciprocated, it almost reactivated the limerence, but then it was strange having the reciprocation there, because often limerence occurs as a result of a lack of reciprocation, right? I mean, we talk about limerence in a way where you are so obsessed with a person, you invent things about them. You're in love with a caricature or a persona that you've invented in your mind, and they are all consuming, and you're anxious about them, and you only think about them. And I think that in a lot of ways, I idealized this individual and existed in that state of limerence. And so it was weird then having him in front of me in reality, and how some things did stack up in terms of what I had anticipated. And I suppose maybe some things didn't. But now I think with the separation, I just have reverted back to that original pining. And even though I have new data that probably would help not complicate the picture, but I suppose bring it more into focus, right? I feel like limerence is more of a nebulous feeling, like you're blanketed in it, whereas having him in front of me drew the situation into focus, right? I had tangible characteristics to hold on to. I think now that he's been away for some time, I've lost that tangibility. And so the things that were in line with the vision or were not in line with the vision have sort of dissipated, and the ideal has taken its stead. And I think that ideal has almost sharper claws in some ways, because the potential that I had been holding on to almost happened. And I think that's worse. Because I'd finally pried the claws out of my body And then they reattached themselves and I suppose struck a little bit deeper. And I think it's harder for me to shake it off because it's not just a fantasy that I entirely constructed myself. It's now this co-creation of a fantasy with the reality of a person. And while those realities, when I think about them now, have fallen a little bit more to the back burner, I think the impact that they had in my envisionment of a relationship in the future, right? Like my hope for the future, it's just made the claws sink deeper. And every couple of months, he shows up in my dreams, and it's not anything crazy. It's just sort of reminding me of his existence. And the ways that we interact were similar to our last interactions, which are in line with those who should be in a relationship, I suppose. And it just sucks. It sucks to be revisited by that, by a vision or image or future that I'm fairly certain won't come to fruition. And I don't even know if he would want it to come to fruition. I get confused in some ways. You see all across social media people talking about if he wanted to, he would. And there were so many things that he said to me those 5 years later that bred confidence. And I think while the geography is a large barrier, I guess I had, I don't know, been taught in a lot of ways by the fantasy that we've all been presented online, in the same way that we were taught as kids that the people who really would want to would move heaven and earth. And I know that real life is more practical than that. And as someone who tends to be more practical than not, I wouldn't ask that of anybody else, to throw away all practicality, especially knowing in general, not necessarily exactly how his brain works, but the kind of person he is and the integrity that he has and dedication to whatever is in his life. I guess feel a little bit hurt that I wasn't part of that plan when he knew. And I guess maybe he didn't know the full extent of it, and I tried to communicate that during our more recent interaction. And maybe that hurt my case a little bit because it's just, it can be too much, right? To find out that somebody's been thinking about you for that long of a time. Or maybe he just, I don't know, wanted free affection. There are so many possibilities. It's just here I am sort of stuck between trying to figure out how much could be love and how much could be limerence. I think the majority of it is limerence. And I think that, funnily enough, he would fight that terminology. Even there's that Lana song, right? About Margaret and Jack, right? It's like Jack Antonoff and Margaret Qualley. And it's all about when you know, you know. And for some reason, I thought, since it had all come full circle, that I had that across the room moment, and then to have it be reciprocated, I just thought that that was it for me. I thought I found it. I thought I found what everyone says we're supposed to find. But real life gets in the way, no matter how the movies put it, right? No dragon, no thorn to bushes, no sleeping curse, no magical carriage. Nothing can separate the two of them. And I think, unfortunately, that's not reality. Even as much as my dreaming self, I suppose, hopes it is. My subconscious likes to remind me every couple of months. It's interesting too, because people often say that when you dream about somebody, it means that they're thinking of you. And the last time I had a dream that he was in, which was some time ago, we had a text exchange, and he had ended up thinking about me the day that I had had that dream. So maybe it's come up again, and maybe he will text me at some point. I just don't know what I'm holding out for. And what if it was all for nothing? Not necessarily what our relationship or friendship ended up turning into, but more what that across the room sensation was. What if it was nothing? That's the thing too. Often our nervous system is triggered by things in our environment for no reason at all. And it's almost like reading tea leaves sometimes, trying to figure out what it all means. And I know as a person, my tendency is to intellectualize or rationalize and try from a cognitive perspective to understand my feelings. I think that's a way I find I can stabilize myself and not get buried in them. But maybe that feeling was meant to be fleeting, and I took it to mean more than it was, because our lives are so different from one another's, and where we're headed, our directions are so different. And all the things that I would put on a list for somebody to fulfill for me in a relationship, I don't necessarily know if it would be a mirror image of him. I'm not sure. And I think that's also part of why I struggle with dating apps. Sometimes it is a feeling. I would say more often than not, it is a feeling. And looking at these truncated resumes, including pictures and short quips, it just doesn't do it for me. Because more often than not, it really doesn't matter what they look like or their credentials. It matters how they make me feel. How I feel in their presence, I guess, is more what I mean. It's somebody who can take me out of my own head. They make me feel as though I don't exist. Like the body I occupy is nothing. And I'm sure people have had that experience before where you're having such a great time with a friend that almost the only thing that is material is the flow of conversation between you, the laughter, the jokes. I feel like I become immaterial. And that's the exact type of person that I want, is someone who can just take me out of that, removes my self-consciousness, because I know whatever physical form I'm in doesn't matter. Yeah, so maybe down the line I'll talk about dating apps, but as of now, I'm not enjoying them and haven't had much success. I think it's just there's a lot to sort through, and I don't have the emotional capacity to invest in each individual and try to figure out if they're for me. Whereas in a public setting, you can quickly figure it out, right? People have tendencies or mannerisms that you can fairly easily pick out, and I don't know, it helps craft this composite image that sure continues to develop over time, but you sort of get a decent understanding within a shorter period of time because you get a more comprehensive view of a person. Whereas not even seeing just one facet online, like that's not even one facet, that's like a sub facet. It's the tiniest sliver of what that person is, and it's self-selected, and so as a result it's filtered by who they believe they are, which in some ways can be clouded judgment, and so you never really know what you're getting. And I never want to make anybody feel less than. And I think unfortunately when it comes to the world of dating or determining compatibility, somebody's going to be left feeling less than because there's going to be some degree of rejection. And sure, you can view it in the more positive way as redirection or mutual incompatibility. And I think wishful thinking is hoping that the incompatibility realization occurs simultaneously. I think more often than not, it doesn't, and it's one-sided. And I don't enjoy that. I don't enjoy having to share that conclusion that I've come to independently with the other party. I don't enjoy that at all. And it hasn't gone over super well for me in some contexts. And so here I am left thinking about people who occasionally visit my dreams and the could have beens of college, I guess. And it's not necessarily that I wish I did anything differently in college because there was nothing else I could have done. It's more just, I don't know, I guess it's a wistful feeling. I suppose I derive some sense of calm or peace thinking about that particular relationship, and not necessarily what it could have been because I don't think my brain has entirely given up on it. So I guess what it could be. But then the more I think about it, the more limerence I feel. And then he just takes more and more real estate in my mind. And for what? The realities aren't going to change. So that's where I am. Ideally, things will continue to evolve down the line, and perhaps this limerence will turn into something more, or perhaps not. And it'll just stay as is, and I'll go through the same recovery process that I did both during and after college, and hope that in another 5 years at the next reunion, he doesn't do it all over again. Or he decides to come and get me prior to then. time will tell. Let me know in the comments if this is something that you've experienced, how you found love, if you're still embedded in limerence, anything along those lines I think would be interesting. And feel free to respond to each other because I think that can be helpful for everybody. So take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.